Hello again, everyone. So, here I am, 4 years, almost to the day, after leaving Florida aboard Phoenix. I'm now aboard Sunshine, once again leaving Florida, but this time I'm leaving from Tampa. I found Sunshine over on the east coast of Florida and went over and looked at it, decided to buy it, and brought it partially or down through the intercoastal waterway to Miami, down south around the Florida Keys, up to Key West, then up to Tampa, went up the river again the same way, and had almost the exact same experience with a big lightning and thunderstorm, but fortunately not quite so much wind this time, so I was able to get in up the Manatee River, but it was pitch black, dark nighttime by the time I got up there. And rather than try to go into the narrow entrance of the marina, I decided to anchor out in the more open part of the river for the night. Anyway, I got up the next morning, putted the boat in there, uh, met the people for the first time in the Sneed Island Boat Works. And no, it wasn't the first time. I re-met them. It had been a number of months because after I first got back with Phoenix and sold it, I spent some time visiting with family and helping my sister do a big list of honeydews she had on her house, and boat shopping, and selling my own house, relocating myself down further south, very close by where I had the boat. Anyway, I made arrangements to have the boat hauled out of the water and trucked over to my nephew's house, which was a fairly short distance away, propped up on stands, and then I began another rebuild process, not nearly as involved as the one I did with Phoenix, but still 7 months of pretty much full-time work. Repainting the mast, putting on new rigging, rearranging the interior layout a bit, things like that. And we got the boat, relaunched it, got it provisioned, and took off in May again. Once again, really too late in the season. Should have been in the Marquesas or even the Tuamotus by May, but I wasn't. So I headed out and started going south from Tampa. Went around west of the dry Tortugas, and then tried to get myself down to Panama. That proved to be a bit of a struggle because south of Cuba, the Gulf Stream runs from east to west and had a very strange southeasterly wind on top of that. So it was quite difficult getting the boat down to Panama. I eventually had to go almost all the way to Jamaica to make enough easting to be able to go down south to Panama, which I was, of course, able to do, and made all the arrangements for a passage through the Panama Canal. This is my second trip through the Panama Canal. Then, pretty much like I did on Phoenix, I headed down to the Galapagos. Once again, a long, difficult passage, almost dead to windward. In retrospect, I would have done better to have gone south out of Panama until hitting the southeast trade winds, and then going west to the Galapagos. There was a boat, the guy who was the captain of it, a pleasant younger Frenchman, That's the way he went, and he left Panama after I did and got to the Galapagos before I did, and was actually already gone from the Galapagos by the time I arrived there. I met him again in the Marquesas later on. So anyway, it was off to the Galapagos, got down there, didn't stay for too long. Once again, similar problem. It's too late in the season to dally much. So I headed off to the Marquesas. Unfortunately, the conditions weren't quite as good on this passage as far as wind and wind direction. So I was sailing much more nearly downwind. Passage once again from the Galapagos to the Marquesas took 22 days and wasn't a bad passage, but I was hoping for a somewhat faster passage and southeast trade winds instead of east trade winds. And same problem again. It's late in the season, can't stay there long, got to get moving again. So I headed down to Rangiroa in the Tuamotus, got in there, same thing, it's late in the year, tourist season is over. I think there was no other boats except boats that belonged to some locals in the lagoon there. So I didn't stay very long, headed out, went down to Tahiti. This time I was able to get into Papeete, and of course you can't go on the queue anymore, the wall. You have to go around south inside the lagoon and either go into one of the marinas or anchor out. So I anchored out, did my clearance in because I had done that Pacific puddle jump deal where they have an agent in Tahiti that handles all the paperwork. That proved to be, I thought, a very worthwhile investment. It was only a little over $100 and absolutely zero hassles. Anyway, I went to the society to Tahiti. Briefly went over to Moorea and then Raiatea. I didn't go to Bora Bora this time again because too late in the season. And I headed out of there for the Cook Islands. I went to Rarotonga again, stayed there briefly, went up to Aitutaki, had to really squeak to get through the channel into the little harbor area, and Aitutaki actually had to power the boat through about 10 or 15 meters of sandy bottom because the tide was going down and out. But I managed to get in, had a very pleasant time there, spent a bit of time there enjoying myself, and then took off. Much of this early part of the trip from Panama across the Pacific, the Eastern Pacific, was pretty much just like it was on Phoenix. So I went up to Suvarov because I really liked it there again, and stayed there for a while, and then headed out to Samoa for the same reasons. Once again, a good place to provision. Developed, had a real problem with the motor. Eventually got rid of the motor. Had to buy another. I bought a used motor. Had it shipped out there. Had to install it. Wound up staying through hurricane season in Samoa again. So it's now 2010, 11. I left in 2010, so now it's 2011. No big rush. I mean, I'm doing okay on time. And my plan is, of course, I'm heading towards the Philippines because I want to go visit Tim and Jess, for, the couple that I met when I was on Phoenix in South Africa. I had a unique experience coming up out of Samoa because I looked at the chart, looked at my course. I was heading to the Marshall Islands, and I thought, well, if I alter course just a little bit, I can cross the equator in the international dateline at the same time. So the last couple miles, I sat up in the cockpit with my handheld GPS, hand steering the boat to get it to go across both lines simultaneously. And I think I actually went from south to north and about 2 seconds later from west. 2 seconds later from west to east, according to my handheld GPS anyway. One of those fun little accomplishments that not too many people get to experience. Anyway, the weather was good for the most part. Just kept sailing along. Went up to the Marshall Islands. It was a pretty nice sail all the way across. Although, with easterly winds, the winds are getting a bit stronger. And I had to actually slow down the last night because I didn't want to try to get the entrance going into Margereau because it's not very well marked and there's no lights or anything there. So I wanted to wait till daybreak. Anyway, I got into the lagoon at Margereau, went in there, and picked up a mooring, I think, at first. I don't know. I think I might have stayed on that mooring. Anyway, met a man there who I met in New Zealand the first time. He was on a Tartan 27. He'd been sailing for 16 years or something all over the Pacific in this little Tartan 27. Anyway, he had a job working for the Marshallese government for a while, and he was planning to head to the Philippines because his girlfriend was a teacher there in Marshall Islands, and when her contract was over, they were both going to head to the Philippines, which they did do, and I met them later on after I arrived in the Philippines. Anyway, so we took off from the Marshall Islands, and originally I was going to go straight through to Cebu, but the wind started getting light and going a little bit more to the south. So I thought, well, I'll go into Guam. That'll kind of break up that long 2,000 plus mile trip right about in the middle. And since I'm an American citizen, clearing in and out is not a big deal. So I went to Guam, went in there, anchored or picked up a mooring, and the morning I went in, I noticed this guy out there with his dinghy. He was rowing over to me. He had just got in the night before, and he left the Marshall Islands with the idea of sailing back to the west coast of the U.S. And he got up north somewhere to pick up the westerlies, and his mainmast collapsed due to dry rot. So he kind of had to drift the boat from wherever it was that he was. The best case scenario, he thought, was to go into Guam, which is what he did. Fortunately, I was able to give him at least some information, managed to find somebody who bought a boat and was just using it as a floating apartment, but the previous owner had bought a new Lafitte mast and boom for the boat. And even though this guy's boat was a bigger catch rig, the mast from this 34-foot boat was just about the perfect size to fit on his 40-foot boat. He wanted me to stay and help him. I said, well, I really can't, because of typhoons and stuff. But hopefully he got everything put back together. I said, in a way, I know it's a big hassle and annoyance, but now you got a almost brand new aluminum mast on your boat, which he was only going to sail it back eventually to Texas and then sell it. I said it'll make that a little easier, I would presume. However, I don't know ultimately what happened to him. Anyway, stayed there. We rented a car together so we could get out to Guam's a good place for going to the big box stores and getting all kinds of goodies to provision the boat. Took off from Guam and headed over to the Philippines. So it was about an 11-day sail, got up to Cebu, anchored outside the harbor, put the dinghy over, and put it into the harbor, Carmen Harbor, and found, sure enough, there's my friends Tim and Jess. Anyway, Jess came back with the laptop on the boat because they had course marked how to safely get into the harbor. So that made it pretty easy to get in there. Got in there, I dropped the hook, and they took me out to a pretty nice restaurant just up the road that night for a welcoming meal. And of course, a huge squall came through, pouring rain, lightning everywhere, wind blowing like crazy. My anchor drug. There was a guy that was on his boat. He fended me off as I drifted by him. No damage caused to either boat. And eventually my anchor caught again on the bottom. And, he called Tim up and says, "Oh, guy, better get back here. His boat's dragging right down on mine." Anyway, they brought me back to where their little boatyard was, and I climbed out of the car, went out there. My dinghy was half full of rainwater, and on the beach, because the tide had gone down, it was pouring down rain. The wind was blowing, who knows, 30 knots. Lightning all over the place with flashes. The lightning was so close by, the flashes were blinding me. Anyway, I managed to get my dinghy bailed out, drug it over the mud to get it in the water enough to get back to my boat. I got back over to the boat, and within 2 minutes the squall had passed and things were calm again. But I lost half my dinner. I wasn't real thrilled about that. Anyway, I kind of settled in there because that had been my original plan, was to get to somewhere between the Philippines and Thailand. And I stayed there in Carmen for a number of months, and then I thought it'd be interesting to go up to Subic Bay because I had been there once before when I was in the military, went to U.S. Navy dive school there. So I headed up that way. It's about 400 miles. And I stopped a number of places along the way to anchor, usually at night, and eventually got up there to Subic Bay. And while I was there, trying to find a place to keep the boat, anyway, a friend of a friend talked to him. He owned a big resort right on the beach, and I asked him about, he had moorings there, and how much would he charge me to stay on a mooring? And he looked at me and he said, "Nothing. You can stay there for free as long as you want. It looks great having a sailboat sitting outside of my resort." I said, "Well, that's great. I can do that." So the next morning I got up, got the boat out of the Subic Bay Yacht Club Marina, which was outrageously expensive, and put-putted over to and picked up a mooring right off the beach of where his resort was, and proceeded to have a really good time there. The guy had a great restaurant in the resort, ate there almost every night, really good food, and started looking around where to go and what to do next. And I really wanted to go over to Hong Kong, but it was when I first got there, it was too early in the season, being only November. So the recommended passage was to go like in February sometime. So towards the end of February, I headed out of Subic, sailed over to Hong Kong, and then I could only stay there for a couple of weeks because they didn't have much room, and there's so much money flying around in Hong Kong at the time that most of the marinas were filled up. So I was a little concerned because checking the weather, and there was a typhoon coming down the South China Sea, but I had to leave because I couldn't stay in the marina, and there wasn't anywhere else. You can't anchor anywhere in Hong Kong anymore, at least at that time. So I headed out of Hong Kong and went as slow as I dared, hoping that the typhoon would pass enough so I wouldn't get killed, swamped, or whatever from huge waves and wind. Anyway, about the third or fourth day out of Hong Kong, sure enough, I ran into the northern edge of the typhoon as it was going southwest. So I had about a day of 35 to 50 knot winds, and big cresting seas, taking it all on the beam, hiding out down below, heading back to Subic Bay. So I got back down to Subic Bay, And I wound up staying there for a couple more months, but can only stay there from about November to May. From May to November, the southwest monsoon starts blowing, and it blows right into Subic Bay, making staying in the bay at pretty much anywhere, except maybe in the marina, almost untenable. So I headed out and went back down to Carmen Harbor on Cebu. Anyway, I wound up staying in the Philippines for 11 years. And I made that trip up to Subic almost every year for the holidays. That's Christmas and New Year's. Then also one time took off from Cebu, and just as Typhoon Yolanda was coming in, ready to pace the central part of the Philippines with a Category 5 typhoon. But I managed to get out. I knew it was coming. I got out of Carmen Harbor, headed south, went into the bottom end of Negros. There's a nice bay down there. It's very well protected. Spent a couple days down there as the typhoon passed from east to west to the north. So it wasn't too bad. Had about 12 hours of torrential rain, about 12 hours of wind, up in the 35, 45 knot range. And then headed out from Negros, Bonbanon, I think is the actual harbor, because I was going to Taiwan. I'm sorry, not Taiwan, Thailand. So headed out, went down through the East China, the South China Sea towards, went in and stopped a couple places on Borneo, Malaysian Borneo. Stopped in at Brunei, and then eventually kept going on to Singapore. Went into Singapore, went into Raffles again because I was having a little fuel issue, but way too expensive, even more so than it was the first time I went there. Anyway, I went out of there, and in Johor Bahru, which is the end of Malaysia, there was a marina that was still open, functioning, but they were getting ready. It was all silted up. The water was fairly shallow, and they were eventually going to fill the whole area in so they could build on it. Anyway, I went up there and stayed for a few months, did some boat maintenance and all that, tried to extend my cruise visa, but they weren't having that. So we had to take off from Singapore, heading back to the Philippines, which was a bit of a chore, but eventually got back to Palawan. Well, I sent the crew home back to Mindanao, which is where she was from, and I contemplated my naval. I was thinking about trying to sail up to Japan and across the North Pacific back to the west coast of North America. Anyway, I got back to Subic and sat there for a while. Started to actually provision the boat and said, I'm going to stay. But it was, once again, it was getting late in the season to stay in Subic, so I headed back down to Cebu. Anyway, during my time in Cebu, I think I went up to Subic 8 times, made the trip to Hong Kong and back, made the trip to Thailand and back, did a bunch of local sailing. I don't know, something on the order of, if I totaled it all up, around 20,000 miles in and around there, plus the trip over to Thailand and Hong Kong and all that stuff. So here comes rolling along after 11 years. It's 2022, the end of 2022, and I have to leave because my visa, I can only stay for 3 years, and it was still kind of a hassle leaving the country for short duration and trying to get back in again. And most of the guys that were doing that just flew out for a weekend somewhere, one of the nearby countries, and then flew back. But since there had been a change in the president government policies, that was getting more difficult to do. So I said, the heck with it, I'm getting out of here. So provisioned the boat. By this time I had met Dee Dee, and
She wanted to go with me, so off we took and left Carmen Harbor, heading for pretty much the same route down to Singapore. So that's what we did. I wound up going quite a bit to the north and west of Borneo, trying to get the northeast monsoon winds, which never really materialized. But it wasn't a hard sail. It was actually fairly light conditions. And I was really amazed as we were coming down the west or the east side of the Malaysian peninsula how many oil tankers were moored offshore there. There were literally hundreds of them. Of course, the south end of Malaysia is a huge oil producing area, and they got oil rigs all over the place in close to the coast. Anyway, went into eventually Johor Bahru, took a weekend trip over to Singapore. That was rather a nightmare. Singapore, in my opinion, turned into a big police state. It was a little difficult getting across the border. And once we got there, coming back into Malaysia was a little difficult. Not insurmountable, just annoying with the bureaucracy and the paperwork. Generally speaking, the Malaysians treated us quite well for the most part. Anyway, took off from that area and started heading up through the Malacca Straits again to Thailand. We stopped in Pangkor. It was probably the most pleasant stop in Malaysia. But now, after all the boats that had to bail out during the COVID times, not the boats, but the owners of the boats, and left boats behind because they couldn't go anywhere. And once they left, they couldn't get back, and the boats were sinking due to no maintenance, and the moorings or anchors were giving up, and the boats were foundering and going ashore. And the Malaysian government was really tired of having to pay for the removal of all these wrecks. So they instituted this new insurance deal where you had to get the specialized insurance to cover the expense of salvaging the boat if something like that happens. And it was quite expensive. And I thought, this is insane. I'm leaving Pangkor. I'm not coming back to Malaysia. And you want me to spend over $1,000 for insurance that will do me absolutely no good once I leave the marina. But they got a trick up their sleeve. They won't give you exit clearance unless you have the insurance. You don't need it to come in, but you need it to get out. I was not a happy camper. Anyway, I went up to Thailand, no problems there, and headed out from Thailand after a couple of weeks stay doing some of the local touristy stuff, going to see the elephants and the big Buddha and all that good stuff. The first couple of days out of Thailand were great because it's the northeast monsoon season, and I figured the last time I went this way, it carried me all the way across the Indian Ocean to the Seychelles. Well, this time it's not happening that way. After about the third day, the winds started going light, fluky, and often with a westward component. And that began about 2 months of extreme frustration trying to get across the Indian Ocean. I eventually went into Bali in Sri Lanka for various problematic reasons. Headed out of there, tried to get down to the Seychelles again, fighting really strong westerly winds. Blew up my mainsail, looked around, thought, what am I going to do? Well, maybe we can go up to Cochin and get things straightened out. Get up to Cochin, call the harbor control, and they won't even let us come in the harbor because we don't have visas. I said, well, I hadn't planned to come here. This is kind of an emergency. We're almost out of fuel, very low on food, very low on water, got damaged sails, various other things. Well, go anchor down off the coast about 10 miles. Thank you very much. Anyway, I eventually got a hold of the Indian Coast Guard, and they helped us to get in the harbor. But we were sequestered weren't allowed to go ashore, had to stay on the boat 24/7, had no form of communication with the outside world because I couldn't get a SIM card because I couldn't go ashore. And even if I could go ashore without a visa, I couldn't get a SIM card. After about a week of that nonsense, I said, that's it, we're just going to leave. So call up Harbor Control, say, we're leaving. Oh, no, you can't go. You need to check out. I said, why? I never checked in. So they made a big deal out of it. And eventually we managed to get provisions and fuel and got the heck out of Dodge. By the way, I'll never go back to India. Not that I had planned to go there, but I will never go there for any reason because of the way we were treated, which was absolutely abysmal treatment. Anyway, headed out of Cochin, once again trying to get to the Seychelles. And it was a long, difficult passage with very light wind conditions. I burned up all but about 40 liters of fuel. We still weren't close. And finally I said, the heck with it. Just pointed the boat due south. Was trying to pick up the southeast trade winds in the South Indian Ocean and started powering down south. Well, just about the time we were going to run out of that half of that fuel, the wind started to come in from the southeast. And it filled in quite nicely through the next 24 hours. And we actually wound up roaring on into the Seychelles, which was a good thing because I don't know what the heck we would have done. We were, once again, running out of food, almost out of fuel, didn't have enough water. We weren't going to die of dehydration or anything, but it was a little chancier than I would like to have done. Altogether, from the time we left Gali in Sri Lanka until we got to the Seychelles, we were 50 days, that's right, 50 days on the boat without a break, not getting off the boat. Not real happy about that, and especially not happy about the treatment that we received in India. Anyway, the Seychelles was great, had changed a tremendous amount since the last time I had been there. They've gone very European. It's very expensive for everything. But at least they had fairly decent food shopping because there's a lot of boats. They've, for whatever reason, they're doing set the place up to transship. You know, they get a lot of cargo boats coming there and they take the containers off and move around onto other container ships. I'm not sure why they do all of that, but they must get some kind of favored advantages from the Seychelles government. But the problem is, of course, is everything has got much, much more expensive in the Seychelles than it had been when I was there just, well, not just, how many years before that? Like 2008 or something. Anyway, we headed out of the Seychelles, headed for Mayotte. Now we've got the problems again with Dee Dee trying to get a visa to South Africa, getting conflicting information. And eventually they said, well, you could go to the South African embassy in Kenya and arrange for a visa. Well, that turned out to be a nightmare. It didn't work. So eventually, it was time to get out of there. I did need a new mainsail, which I was able to get from, surprise, surprise, a sail maker in Sri Lanka. Had I known they were there, I could have had the sail made when we were in Sri Lanka. But I didn't know that there was one available. Anyway, got a new mainsail, headed out of Kalifi down the coast, which was on again, off again, sometimes a very boisterous sail, but eventually did make it down to Richards Bay. And of course now Dee Dee's got to stay on the, supposed to stay on the boat. She could stay anywhere she wanted in the marina, but legally she wasn't allowed to go anywhere in the country. And we both found that extraordinarily frustrating. They gave her, just said she didn't qualify for a visa, but they didn't give her any reasons. Anyway, headed down out of Richards Bay. It didn't stop anywhere but Simonstown. and spent some time there. Same problem. I mean, I had a bunch of little jobs to do on the boat in Simonstown. And when we got to Richards Bay, I had a new, my staysail had blown up on the passage coming down, so I got a new staysail made, which was great. But we sat there in Simonstown, and, doing a lot of little projects and preparing to take off again. And of course, this time I couldn't just go to Cape Town to check out. I actually physically had to take the boat to Cape Town to clear out of South Africa, which was a bit of a challenge once again with the strong wind blowing into False Bay. But with a slightly bigger boat, we're able to do it in just clear getting out of the bay on actually two tacks, headed south, headed to the east as far as I dared go, and then flipped over to going southwest on the port tack, and just able to get out of the harbor and out around the point there at the southwest end of False Bay and up into Cape Town. So we didn't stay in Cape Town long, only like a day and a half or something to clear out of Africa. We were pretty well provisioned from Simonstown, and next stop, St. Helena. So off we went. Had a pretty easy sail up to St. Helena, nothing super speedy or anything like that. But it was kind of late in the season by the time we got up there, and there weren't really any other cruising boats there. So we cleared in and cleared out there, only stayed 3 or 4 days. I was thinking about going to Ascension, but now both St. Helena and Ascension are doing all these weird stuff when you got to get an e-visa and all this other nonsense. And I said, I think I'll pass on that because there's really nothing in Ascension. So, and the wind wasn't cooperating anyway. It was often very light, not from the right direction. And we set off from St. Helena up towards the Caribbean. I wasn't going to go to Brazil. I didn't want to pay that almost $200 for a visa. So we just set off with the idea of going up to Barbados, first stop. And the reason I wanted to go to Barbados was the same thing. Supposedly the U.S. Embassy there was conducive to getting a visa for Dee Dee to go to the U.S. Well, the first appointment date she could get was too late. And they said, well, go down to Trinidad. It'd be much faster. So it's only a 2-day sail. I was a little unsure about going into Trinidad because of the bad reputation of being a dangerous place. But where we went with the boat turned out to be fine, I thought, at least at first. And she was able to get her appointment in the U.S. Embassy for her interview for her visa, and they just flat out denied it. So now she's going to go back to the Philippines. The problem is, flying out of Trinidad, most flights go through the U.S., heading back to the Philippines one way or another. And the trouble is, she's got to get a transiting visa, something I had never heard of before, just for a 4-hour layover in like JFK in New York City. So we're still waiting for her appointment for that. I don't know if she's going to get the transit visa or not. If not, I'll have to find some other way to get her back to the Philippines. Because she needs a visa to go to Grenada, or to the U.S., or to some of the other places in the Caribbean. And of course now, just had Hurricane Beryl went barreling through to the north. It wasn't a danger where we were in Trinidad, fortunately, but all the predictions are for this year, 2024, to be really bad. as far as the weather and hurricanes are concerned. So I'm content to sit down here. It's not a bad place, not too expensive. Most things are pretty readily available. We're, Sunshine and I are sitting here at 60 degrees west longitude. Well, once I cross 80 degrees west longitude, that will be the finish of the second circumnavigation. I figure based on my estimates and calculations of all the sailing that I've done, somewhere around the time coming from St. Helena up to Barbados, we crossed the equator, and by the time we crossed the equator, I had reached 100,000 miles. So it's going to be, by the time we get back up to Florida, it will be, 105, 106, 107,000 miles I will have sailed by that time, which will be presumably sometime later in 2024. So that's it. That's the adventures of me on Sunshine and sailing over 50 years, although most of the sailing has been far more recent. Figure I've spent over 1,000 days at sea to cover 100,000 miles. Bye for now.